Good morning, everyone. I'm calling my homily today, Ground Truthing and Abundant Life. Mary Oliver's The Pond is a lovely ode to summer, drinking the sun and seeing the lilies again spread across the water, wanting to touch each other. At the beginning of the poem, she says she wishes she could sing. And at the end, she hopes that, who knows, maybe I'll be singing. She has always been able to feel happiness and acknowledges that each of us wears a shadow. In summer, we watch the lilies bowing to each other and slide on the wind with the tug of desire, close to one another. This robustness, this love of life, lends itself to hope in the pond. In Mark's gospel reading, there's a very different feel. The Pharisees and teachers of the law ask the question of Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands? Jesus throughout the Gospels admonishes people who follow the letter of the law, following rules, while they don't seem to grasp the spirit of God, which is about love for both God and each other. They honor God with their lips, but their hearts are far from me, in one translation. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. Jesus then says to the crowd, nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. Of course, this isn't an ode to not washing one's hands. Far be it from me to push that idea in a pandemic. But rather, Jesus continually pushes us to decide whether we are narrowly following bureaucratic rules or loving God and our neighbor as ourselves. So contrasting Mark's gospel with the pond provides us differing visions. One, a narrow view that misses the bigger point, with one of a vision of joy and love and robust hope. I can imagine Jesus being frustrated once again by the Pharisees' rule moribund, sourly chasing Jesus with accusations of breaking a variety of rules, even if washing your hands is one of the better rules to keep. How can we put these two visions of life into our modern context? We live in polarized times, climate change, with wildfires and floods heralding urgent change is needed, but denied or diminished by most leaders around the world. The disaster unfolding in Afghanistan, imperialists leaving after decades, trying to force this country into their vision of stability, while leaders say with hypocrisy, we never said we'd rebuild your country. Lecturing with the disdain that only the wealthy can voice, time you took care of your own country. The despair we feel watching people falling off the outside of departing planes, our abandonment of those who supported the Canadian and allied diplomats, journalists, and others. We have all watched in horror as the numbers of those buried in unmarked graves at former residential schools grows higher and higher, almost 2,000 now, while pushing governments and churches to do more creates more frustration because the response is so paltry compared to the need. fighting for clean water for Indigenous communities has finally meant some money being offered as we move towards an election. Hard not to be cynical after Indigenous communities and allies have demanded this for years. The city has been duplicitous in its work with encampment residents and advocates and activists, saying one thing and doing another. One department looking the other way, while another department moves in with aggression and brutality. Just today, we learned that the city led the court order to stop Khalil Javrait. I think I was pronounced his name right, from building and placing tiny shelters on city land for encampment residents. As Len described in a homily a few Sundays ago, the number of nuclear arsenals could still destroy the world many times over. The world is vulnerable to many of these weapons being used. Wealthy nations who have stockpiled life-saving vaccines are hoarding them, while the death rate continues to climb in countries with limited access to vaccines. Wow. As Vivian said at the beginning of the service, this is all overwhelming. While we celebrate the glories of nature, the blue skies, the lakes and rivers and parks we are able to enjoy in summer, what do we do with these urgent needs for action? Will we be like the Pharisees who pick apart the rules not being followed? The bylaw infractions of tents in our parks, the bureaucracy and cost around doing the right thing for the people in Grassy Narrows, the paltry amount of support given to Indigenous communities for clean water and investigating the murder of Indigenous women and girls. How long has it taken the provincial government to help schools get proper ventilation? And the lack of federal and provincial governments to really move on affordable and supportive housing for those who are houseless or homeless. I don't know about you, but when I feel overwhelmed and powerless, it's very hard to know what to do. I think the pond and Mary Oliver's words give us some clues. Mary Oliver, who can now sing after watching the lilies, can describe us as well. When we fill our lungs with the air of hope and know, really know, that love is stronger than the narrow-minded, sour rules of counting cost, worrying about votes, duplicitous lying to stall for time, thinking short-sightedly about one's own comfort, hoping people forget the promises, the reluctance to apologize, to make actions count, to stop and listen to those in encampments, living on reserves, trying to survive. Indigenous communities have started the process of ground truthing. It is a term used in various fields referring to information that is known to be real or true, or information that is collected on location. This is especially meaningful as Indigenous communities seek sites of unmarked graves, literally seeking the truth from the ground. This term could also be used as grounding our vision of hope on what is true. And for that, we need to know the truth. It reminds me of Marilyn Dolmage's brave support and advocacy for those at Huronia. It doesn't make sense to have hope in the process of reconciliation with our Indigenous sisters and brothers if we don't know the whole truth about what has happened, and then to listen deeply, deeply apologizing for wrongs committed, and then taking action based on what Indigenous people say they need and want. Hope without ground truthing would be naive at best. In a recent Star article, Why We Wear Orange, Doug George Canantillo, who is an Akwesasne Mohawk and residential school survivor, writes that wearing orange was and is an act of defiance. It began when Phyllis Jack Webstad of the Stiswessemet Katawatan Nation was stripped of her orange shirt when she was taken to a residential school. It has become a symbol of defiance across the nation. The Walk for Joe recently took place, which followed the route of Joe Kamanda, a 13-year-old Algonquin boy from Pikwakanagan and his brother, who ran away from the Mohawk Institute. Joe was hit by a train while he ran away and died. The last fatality stemming from the violence at the Anglican-run Mohawk Institute in Brantford. It was the subsequent investigation into his death that led to the closure of the Mohawk Institute in 1971. Acts of defiance and truth-telling provide hope to us all. As a settler and ally, I humbly ask us to look at the 7 fire prophecies of the Anishinaabe from the wisdom of the Ojibwe people. Each of these fire prophecies look at epochs or ages of people on Turtle Island, culminating in the current age of the 7th fire, a time when new people are emerging and trying to retrace steps back to the wisdom of the elders. These new people will need to be strong to create a rebirth of the Anishinaabe nation. The hope is that now the sacred fire will again be lit. As the prophecy continues, it is at this time that the light-skinned race will be given a choice between 2 roads. If we, choose the right road, then the 7th fire will light the 8th and final fire, an eternal fire of peace, love, sisterhood, and brotherhood. If the light-skinned race makes the wrong choice of roads, the destruction which they brought with them in coming to this country will come back at them and cause much suffering and death to all the earth's people. Traditional Mide or spiritual healers have interpreted the 2 roads that face the light-skinned race. One way is the continuation of headlong rush to technological development and destruction. And the other way is to a deeper spirituality, the slow path that traditional Indigenous people have for millennia have traveled and are now seeking again. Let us look for signs of this 8th fire and stand with our Indigenous sisters and brothers to look for the right path. This is the path that will lead to real change, to real hope in the future. Let's make this end of summertime, moving into harvest fall, a time to make our voices heard. Voices that say, yes, put money into fighting climate change, changing our first world lifestyles, and away from weapons. Yes, justice for Indigenous and people of color. Yes, looking at welcoming the refugees. And yes, looking at creating homes for every single person in Toronto, our country, and our world. Help us to build our strength on real hope, built on ground truthing and action, on following Jesus' call to love, rather than following narrow rules and self-interest. Let us look to the beauty of nature, the beauty of the world given to us by our Creator, and fill our lungs with the air of hope. Let us bound over the hills singing and fight with love and hope and joy for a world built on love for all creation. And together, let us light the eighth fire.